Greetings, dear listeners. It's the summer doldrums. It's hot out there. We at Wisdom of Crowds are taking a break this week from politics and war and Donald Trump. Instead, we're talking about culture. Paul Elie is our guest. Paul is a writer whose words have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and several other places. He's a leading religion and culture writer in the U.S. today. His latest book is titled The Last Supper: Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s, and it tells the story of artists in that decade who grappled with religious ideas and stirred up controversy while doing it. Some of your favorite artists are in that book: U2, Madonna, Andy Warhol, Sinead O'Connor, Robert Mapplethorpe, Martin Scorsese, many more. It's an exciting book that not only speaks about the 80s, but has something to say to our own time and its own cultural scene. You will enjoy this conversation. Before we get started, though, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paid subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the whole conversation with Paul, along with other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show. This is a little known story. Paul wrote a book called The Life You Save May Be Your Own, and it was published in like 2002, I think.
2003.
2003. And it came out when I was in college. It's a book
High
about...
school, I believe.
No, I wrote you in my first year of college.
Rockhurst, okay, yeah.
Yeah. And so I read the book when I was in college, and I was very bored in college. My first year was not very satisfying intellectually, and I was reading random stuff. Luckily, I read your book, and I wrote you a letter, and you did email me back, and I was like, oh my God, it's easier to connect with these people than I thought. And then...
it was a great letter. I probably still have it somewhere.
And then Paul was working at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which listeners may or may not know was like the holy of holies of American literature for a while, where they published everyone from like Susan Sontag to Flannery O'Connor to who else?
Wolfe, McPhee, Tom Friedman, Ian Fraser, Franzen, Eugenides, Alice McDermott, Heaney, Walcott, Brodsky, Zagieski, Les Murray.
And Paul has edited
people
a few
I knew.
of those. And so then we became friends. Correspondence was born. Fast forward 20 years later, now I have the honor of having you on our podcast for your new book. Where is it?
You have it? You can hold it up?
This is his third book. There was a book in between the one.
Oh, double screen. Very good. I have it electronically. Supper. I can't hold it up myself.
Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy, in the 1980s, which I think is sort of, my theory is that it's a bit like part two of his first book, of Paul's first book, which was about four Catholic writers in the 50s, 60s, 70s, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Flannery O'Connor, and Walker Percy. And in that book, he told a four-part story that covers the mid-century, covers art, politics, religion, and it covers a lot of the 60s. This book is about the 80s, and it covers many more artists than just four. It covers musicians, it tells a story of U2, of the Smiths, of Leonard Cohen's midlife crisis, of Brian Eno, but also tells the story of Andy Warhol, of AIDS in the 1980s,
William
the protests,
Kennedy.
ACT UP protests.
But yeah, so Paul, just give us a sense of, to give listeners sort of an in. I think that's a good sort of broad intro by Santi. But give us a sense of, as you sat down to write the book, it is a sprawling snapshot, but it does have a thesis. And it'd be great if you could just sort of maybe I don't know, sketch that out for us a little bit. What's the thread that ties all of this together?
Sure thing. And do you mind if well, why don't I just go ahead and say that Santi's right, that this book is kind of a diptych or a conjoined twin with my first book, The Life You Saved May Be Your Own. That book is about mid-century Catholic writers, and I did a lot of events in connection with the book and interviews, and always the question came up, where are their successors? Who are their successors? And there are certain people working that vein. I already mentioned Alice McDermott, Marilyn Robinson, another. But in effect, this book is the answer to that question. I wouldn't say that Andy Warhol is a successor to Thomas Merton, but question of where the energy involving religion and culture went. In the middle of the century, in the book that I wrote and in the story that I told, it was people of Orthodox belief working in different ways on the margins of the American century. Dorothy Day was a marginal character by intention, as an anarchist living on the Lower East Side. A Trappist monk opted out of American culture. Walker Percy left New Orleans to live in the pleasant non-place of Covington, Louisiana, a kind of emerging suburb. And Flannery O'Connor was, in a pretty remote part of Georgia. And they weren't terribly popular, too. That's often forgotten, except for Merton and Percy with The Moviegoer. So they were, in faith, close to the center of Catholicism and working at the margins of American mass culture. So with this book, and now I'm getting to answer your question, it's a book about people in the arts who are working on the margins of formal religion, but close to the center of American mass or popular culture in the 80s. And how are they doing that? They're doing it through work that I call crypto-religious. Now, the term comes from Czesław Miłosz, who figures into that first book. He was corresponding with Thomas Merton in the late 50s, and he characterized himself as crypto-religious, drawing a contrast between Miłosz, the poet, an emigre who'd had to be stealthy about his Catholic affinities under communism, and also in the bohemian cafe society of Paris that he wound up in after leaving Poland, contrasting himself with the kind of explicitly religious Trappist monk Merton. So flash forward a couple of decades, and Miłosz is still active. He's still a crypto-religious artist. He's won the Nobel Prize, but he's moved closer to the center. He's meeting John Paul at Castle Gandolfo. He's in Rome writing poems with a religious imagery, but he's still working in a kind of stealth mode. So his term then becomes a key that opens a decade for me. All of these artists, and Santi mentioned a bunch of them, some of them, Prince and Madonna and Leonard Cohen and U2 and the Smiths, the filmmakers Wim Wenders and Martin Scorsese, the novelist William Kennedy and Toni Morrison and Don DeLillo and others, the visual artists Warhol, Andre Serrano, Robert Mapplethorpe, etc., at Elie, I should say. What do I mean when I say they're crypto-religious? They're making work that uses plainly religious motifs, imagery, themes, patterns, but from a position that's something other than conventional belief. So you encounter this work. Let's take Bob Dylan's Gonna Serve Somebody from his first gospel album, So Train Coming. You hear that and you wonder, what does he believe? Is this metaphor or is this real? Is he tapping into American roots music, or just kind of doing the latest shape-shifting thing in his career, or is he really gone for the Lord, or some version of all of those things? And then the whole act of asking yourself, what does this artist believe? Is this authentic? Is this sincere? Leads you to reflect on your own beliefs. How metaphorical is my religion? How much is it bound up with culture, and how much kind of standing apart from culture? And that encounter just runs through the book as it, I think, ran through that decade, and I try to capture the kind of kinetic feeling of what it meant to have religion kind of everywhere you looked, hiding in plain sight, at a moment when Richard John Neuhaus, the neoconservative cleric, said the public square was naked. In fact, there was crypto-religious imagery all over the place.
But so, Paul, the thing I want to sort of press you on, which I found fascinating, because Miloš is sort of at the heart of it. But his crypto-religious thing comes from the fact of growing up in an incredibly, state repressive apparatus, right? Where communism really finds the ultimate threat of religion to its power, to its sort of authority. And so his approach is one of, I guess, sort of, evading repression. But what I'm struck by a lot of the characters in your book is not that they are, that they relate in that sort of similar way. It's not that yes, I guess overall the feeling in the 80s was one of sort of secularism triumphing, but they're not fighting against it in the same way that someone like Miloš is struggling against communism, if that's right. You get the sense that a lot of them are pulling on aspects of their upbringing, the cultural upbringing, their religious upbringing, reacting to it, struggling with it, adapting it in order to create art. But I kept sort of running into that feeling that, there's a difference between what Miloš is describing and what a lot of these artists, not all of them, I think there are parallels, but there's a spectrum there, right?
Absolutely. So first of all, Miloš didn't grow up under communism. He was born in 1915 or so.
Oh, that's right.
So he was 30 years old at the end of World War II when communism came in. So in that regard, he
predates
has something in common with those other artists, which is that he grows up in a Catholic culture and then winds up living his public life in a different culture.
Right.
And I'm not saying that the different culture of 80s discos that was frequented by Madonna and Keith Haring and Warhol was analogous to the Soviet repressed Poland, but in a broader sense, they're displaced people. What am I going to do with this Catholic inheritance that I have? No one can tell me how to do it, especially when it comes to sexual matters. The church isn't able to speak confidently or authoritatively in that moment. So these different people who've all had a thick culture, as it's called, religious upbringing, are trying to work it out for themselves in an environment that doesn't have clear lines as to how you should do that. And there's definitely a spectrum, and that's really important that you brought it up. I'm in no way saying that Robert Mapplethorpe is a believer on the level of Czesław Miloš. It's kind of varieties of crypto-religious experience, and it's really important to capture all the varieties and not to form a kind of club or team, but rather to capture the varieties.
So there is a sort of family resemblance, if you will.
I think so.
So instead of a concept, it's just something they all share together because of generational experience. So I think...
Oh, go on.
What Miloš lost and what the American artists that you're talking about and the European artists that you're talking about lost is the same thing, which is a unifying Christian culture, right? They lost it in different ways because Miloš's was bombed out of existence, whereas the American one disappeared because of, prosperity and secularization. But in a way, they do all have a similar experience of uprootedness. And I think the more, not controversial, I don't know what word I'm looking for, but the less conventional wisdom part of your book is that you do still affirm a certain religiosity in these figures, right? It's cryptic, but it's still religious, right? There is the religious side of it, and it's going to be, it should be hard for people to just accept right away that there's a cryptic religiosity to some of these figures, like Morrissey, like Andres Serrano, who we talked about in a recent podcast, actually, when we were talking about blasphemous art. he dipped the crucifix in a vial of his own urine and took a beautiful photograph of it. Like, in what sense are all these figures religious? Like, how do you define religion? What is it that they're grappling with? What is the religious side of the cryptic religiosity that you're talking about?
It's a really good question, and I think I'm trying to distinguish this crypto-religious disposition from what would be called formal or revealed religion, because I think that level of definitional precision is just what we need right now, and the best way to do it is narratively. But to back up a bit, it's an important argument of the book, and not original to me, that it wasn't a secular world. The book chronicles the beginning of the post-secular age that I think we're in now. It was widely supposed that, the America and the West was becoming progressively more secular, and that born-again Christians were fighting the godless secularists. In fact, the country was becoming religiously more diverse, where you had, it could no longer claim to be a Christian nation demographically, or in the sense that first Protestants and then Catholics had a claim to preeminence in the society. Rather, you were seeing in the 80s, and Dylan saw this was the slow train coming, that he saw coming around the bend, a multi-religious society in which different faiths, different levels of religious adherence, and no faith all are contending in the public square over contested territory. And that's how is that kind of announced in the 70s, late 70s? The moral majority is formed, partly out of a sense that the Christian character of America is being altered, and they want to kind of get that back. Meanwhile, you have Islamic fundamentalists taking over Iran and taking American hostages, and reminding everybody who watched on television every night that not only is the world not just becoming less religious, but there's this whole other religion that many people had given very little thought, Islam, that suddenly bears very strong on the American reality. And then Bob Dylan, the Jewish counterculture rebel and independent par excellence, is somehow embracing evangelical Christianity. This is just way more complicated than any simple thesis of secularization allows. And so many of the controversies that are spelled out in the book involve a shift that we can recognize in retrospect that was dimly perceived at the time. The shift from a predominantly Christian society that was seen as doing battle with secular modernity to a post-secular society that's religiously diverse and in which no religion has a voice in the conversation.
Can I ask, the part that's interesting about it? I mean, you're talking about this diversity of faiths, this like profusion of it. I mean, it's a kind of in the artists that you trace out, that diversity and this like crypto-religiosity you talk about. I mean, there's two things that come to mind. One is a very American sort of thing about like make your own religion in a way, like, feeding from sources of, whatever upbringing they might have had, whether they're Jewish, whether they're Catholics, and then sort of, I don't know, creating something new out of these things. So in that sense, there's something very like modern and American, and in a sense like post-denominational, maybe not like post-secular, but also post-denominational. It's like creating its own thing, which again, I mean, I guess America has seen that in even organized religion with how many denominations have sprouted up in this country. Like you just like it is choose your own religion in a lot of ways, and this is now in your book and your telling sort of it emerges, I guess, in pop culture. But on the other side, a lot of the artists themselves, I mean, so that's a sort of the secular American way to look at it. But I'd also like you to maybe talk a little bit about the extent to which some of these artists are also kind of like modern mystics in a way, right? That kind of personal exploration of the transcendent, right, ends up being unmediated by whatever kind of organized religious structures, is the experience of sort of ancient mysticism as well, right? I mean, you do get that in art often, and like art is a manifestation of that. Is that a fair characterization of some of this?
It's not only fair, it's super perceptive. And thank you. I mean, you use the word experience. So in the Catholic world, and I know this not exhaustively, but I know it through writing part of a book about Thomas Merton, mysticism is experience. The mystic wants an experiential knowledge of God and not a propositional knowledge or a knowledge through history or even through ritual and sacrament. So for Merton, just to backtrack a bit, he was staggered by the suggestion in the books that he read about medieval philosophy, but especially about medieval monastic practice, that God was really there to be known, and that on some level your life as a Christian consisted in really knowing God. And if there was a way that God could be known especially intensely, which was through the life of organized prayer and observance in an intensely focused way, why wouldn't you do that? If it's there awaiting you, how could you turn away from that? So I'm working by analogy here. I'm not saying that Madonna is a mystic on the level of a Carthusian, but what happened in the 80s was that for various reasons that I develop in the book, and you can talk about as much as or little as we want, the experience of large numbers of people, among them the artists that the book depicts, was kind of at odds or out ahead of the experiences registered by the formal or institutional church in that moment, especially having to do with matters of sex and sexuality. The Catholic Church's message on sex was no, 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 and no. And even if you were trying to be faithful, and I'm thinking of my friend Richard Rodriguez, who was a gay man in the 80s in San Francisco and a Catholic who went to the Latin Mass, for God's sake. I mean, but his own experience being in San Francisco in that moment was at odds with what the church taught. And as he later said to Cardinal Oveda, who was the Archbishop of San Francisco, what I would like is, I don't expect you to change the teaching of the church about homosexuality, but what I would expect that you would at least acknowledge that my life complicates yours. So the lives in the book are, these artists are kind of representative figures who, for experience that complicates the teaching of the church as it was being delivered in that moment. And sometimes it's through an aggressive confrontation, as in Madonna. Sometimes it's through a kind of testimony, in Morrissey's case, that he saw abusive priests, both physically and sexually, and put it into a song. Sometimes it's through
Headmaster Ritual.
Exactly. Sometimes it's
Great
through that's just the yearning that Bono and U2 expressed was pretty strongly at odds with the very prosaic character of a lot of post-Vatican II Catholic practice. Here were guys singing Gloria in Latin. For some of us, that was the first Latin we'd ever really heard. Really going for the heavens at a time when a characteristic Catholic worship was a very plaintive folk mass. So just to wind back to your original insight, these artists have an experience that's inflected with religion and are trying to articulate it in ways that sometimes runs out ahead of the church, sometimes runs at odds with the church, but a lot of it was popular because plenty of other people recognized that experience as akin to their own.
Okay, so let me jump in here because I think at this point in the conversation, we've shown how you challenge two American myths or American stories that Americans tell about themselves. One of them was Richard Neuhaus's The Naked Public Square, which you mentioned earlier, which, Richard Neuhaus was this Lutheran, later Catholic intellectual, later neocon advisor to George W. Bush, and he wrote a book in the 80s called The Naked Public Square, basically saying secularism is destroying, well, it's not destroying, but secularism is dominating America so that Christians and any religious people can't use religiously inspired moral arguments in the public square. Everyone has to be a sort of start from secular premises and end with secular conclusions, right?
Check your religion at the door is the way he put it.
Check your religion at the door, of the public square. And you're saying, no, if you look at the actual public square at the time, you had religion everywhere in very interesting ways. People wrestling with it, people angry at it, people rediscovering it, like Bono and U2 and the Gloria, people angry at it, like Morrissey, Madonna, whatever the hell she was doing. The other thing, though, is what I think Damir just said, which I would challenge a little bit, which is like this American Protestant conception of itself, that this is a place where individuals come to find God unmediated by the church or any other institution. And I think, like, you have to get all the way to the last page of your book, but you say something that I thought was very interesting. You said the crypto-religious outlook thrives on the periphery. It is diminished by wide recognition and dissipates when taken to scale. So you're saying, okay, these artists with this cryptic outlook only thrive when they're at odds with the mainstream. You can't scale it. Everyone nowadays wants to scale. Does it scale? Well, no, this doesn't scale. I'm sorry. At the same time, it depends. So the cryptic religious outlook depends on an encounter with public institutional religion as roots, as adversary, as a community whose aspirations it challenges and deepens. So if public religion atrophies, personal, speculative, improvisatory religion will thin out too. So you're saying that the individual genius and the individual experience is not enough. You do need some sort of institution to bounce up against, to fight against in a way. So Andy Warhol was, in his bohemian existence in Manhattan, but he also needed the Byzantine Catholic Church to go to on Sundays as a sort of backdrop.
But also, Santi, to be fair, though, I mean, mystics don't scale either, right?
True.
I mean, to be fair, at least on that metaphor, one. And the other one, just to defend the Protestant thing, is true. Protestant churches just like hive off from each other every 20 minutes because of this individualism. Just defending those two things, but I think your question is finish up the question though.
So I'm just saying, like, maybe what Paul has discovered with his book is a sort of historical sweet spot where you had enough of the old institutions to sort of give birth to a generation of artists to fight, and enough like individuality in the culture to also generate artistic ambition. And maybe before you had institutions that were too strong and stifled individuals, and maybe after now you don't even have the institution to fight against. There's not enough left.
But I mean, by all means, let me just piggyback on that, Paul, a little bit. The interesting thing, right? I mean, I think there was a review of your book in Compact, which we'll link as well. They just point out, it's sort of a conservative reaction to your book, but they point out that, there is this like now of course there's intervening decades between your book and now, but there is a resurgence of sort of organized religion as well, and at least an interest in it. So I don't know, maybe take Santi's prompt and then maybe let's just talk a little bit about what happens after your book as well. Like how do we bridge from your book to where we are today? Because I think there's a lot to discuss in there about like just to again get people thinking about these issues and topics.
For sure, and I mean, you're both working in big, like tectonic plates of cultural history that are grinding against each other. I try to be a notch more particular than that because I think that level of sweep is diminished when there aren't lots of details. So, I'm a believing Catholic. I love the church. I don't want the church to go away at all. I think religion is here to stay, and I'm glad about that. What happened in the 80s, the institutional religion became very brittle and unwilling to allow for even a little bit of flexibility in some ways. The best example of this is The Last Temptation of Christ. So when Scorsese was a boy, Martin Scorsese, the filmmaker, he would go to movies in Times Square with a bunch of the altar boys and a young priest who had been posted to Little Italy for his first parish assignment. He was in his 20s. And this priest would take them to the biblical epics in the giant theaters in Times Square, and they'd come back and sit on the rectory steps on Mulberry Street and talk about the movies. This is at the time when movies, many movies were on the index. They were frankly commercial. The Robe and other...
Wait, we have to explain to the listeners out there what the index is.
No, you don't. Catholic Index. It's the censorship line. Go ahead. We got it.
So the church was not a lover of all things coming out of Hollywood at that time.
Right.
But here was a young priest taking these guys to the movies and then talking about in a good, thoughtful, critical way about what was adequate in what those movies and what wasn't. And what astonished, or what struck Scorsese in that moment was that the priest faulted the sentimentality of the movies, not the lack of orthodoxy. He's like, the lightning bolts that reflect God's presence, that's just a bit too much. It's phony. So here's a priest kind of telling it like it is in terms of film. So when The Last Temptation of Christ was made, some fundamentalist agitators, Reverend Donald Wildman, started a letter-writing campaign against the movie before it was even made. This went on for several years, and I won't belabor the point here, but by the time the movie came out, the established opinion was that it was somehow anti-religious or anti-Catholic, and the Catholic prelates followed that line in many cases without seeing it themselves. And Scorsese was, I think it's not an exaggeration to say he was heartbroken. He expected it from the fundamentalist Protestants, but when the Catholic Bishops' Conference issued something about his film with important prelates, Cardinal Law in Boston, saying they weren't even going to bother to see it, it was a dereliction of duty, really. Why couldn't they watch the film? Why couldn't they even consider the thought that you would actually go and see the film the way, in a much supposedly stricter age, a priest had done with these guys who were not even teenagers? Why couldn't, and this is, I'm getting to the point, it's not institutional religion versus do-it-yourself religion. Institutional religion had an opening to be considerably more flexible and thoughtful about complex matters of faith in the 80s than it in fact was. And that's the great counterfactual. What if the church had been open to dialogue or to a consideration or to a gradation of appreciation rather than just simple yes and no in that moment?
Yeah.
Ditto on sexuality.
I think Scorsese maybe...
If the church is open to this reflection now about homosexuality and divorce and remarriage and so forth, even without approving it, why couldn't it have been so then? So the loss of the absence of an institution that Santi mentioned is partly owing to lapses and failures of imagination on the part of people leading the church in that moment, I think.
Yeah, and I think Scorsese is maybe the most, I don't want to say the most emblematic of what you mean by cryptic religiosity, but he's up there because he was born at the tail end of a more or less coherent Catholic culture in New York, right? The Irish Catholic or the Italian Catholic community, where you listen to your parish priest every Sunday. You went to church, and there was a sort of, your faith was sustained by the community. But Scorsese was at the tail end of that, and then he was thrust in the 60s and 70s into this sort of new world of individuality and more prosperity and more opportunities to become an artist. But there's never been a moment when Scorsese was like, I'm no longer Catholic, sorry, peace out. He never rebelled against it explicitly like James Joyce or Morrissey, to quote to two people that you mention a lot in your book. And then he makes this movie in the 80s, The Last Temptation of Christ, which I remember my mom mentioning to me when I was a kid that it's a movie that I should never watch because it's very bad.
Had she seen it?
No, I'm sure she did not. But then fast forward to 20 2016, I think, when Scorsese makes Silence, which is another movie, very religious, also controversial. Also, it was conservative critique against it because it was a movie about Jesuits that were tortured in Japan in the, I forget which century, and rejected Christ in order to survive the torture and the execution. But the story of one of these Jesuits who actually secretly maintained faith and the sort of travails of that. And that was considered, Scorsese is, I don't know what the argument against that movie was, that it was privatizing religion or something. And the latest is, though, that in the last few years, Scorsese's became friends with Pope Francis and with this other Jesuit in Rome, Antonio Spadaro. I've seen several videos of him over there in Rome talking with the Pope. He sponsored a Life of the Saints documentary series for Fox Nation or something. And he's making another movie about Jesus. So he's, I don't know what's happened to him, some sort of return to orthodoxy, but at the same time, I think the church also became a little bit more open to him and to hearing out people like him, I guess.
I think that Scorsese has changed less than the church has changed under Pope Francis. I'm a consultant on that Saint series, and he dreamed of making Lives of the Saints since he was a teenager, in the same way that he dreamed of making Life of Christ even as storyboards from his teens. He was going to do Life of Christ on the West Side. So does it matter that Martin Scorsese has some audiences with Pope Francis? I think it does, because it suggested an openness to the ambiguity that goes with art. Francis urged the church to go to the peripheries. And for me that was really important, because in effect, and he did that in an interview with Father Spadaro, the church should go to the peripheries, to the outskirts. And that's, in effect, what I've tried to do with this book. I'm hearing the Pope go to the outskirts, to the peripheries. So this book is about people who are working on the peripheries of formal belief. So, and I'm not exaggerating to say, day after day, especially during the pandemic, I got up and said, this is what I'm trying to do. Go to the periphery of formal belief and figure out what was going on there, and really take it seriously instead of ingesting the preformed arguments about who was heterodox and who was not. Try to go deep and find the patterns. So one of the things that's going on in the book is breaking out of the patterns of orthodox and heterodox and finding other ones. So Leonard Cohen and Czesław Miłosz are what I call old souls. Bono is a devotee, and they're a pattern of devotion that many of us just feel in ourselves. Most of them are in different ways what I call controverts. They're people who are inwardly divided and are trying to work that out. I mean, a different generation called that alienation. It goes back to St. Paul. There's another law in my member, like the body and spirit at war. So I'm trying to find in these artists patterns in which we can recognize our own religious experience by looking at work that reached many of us, that many of us have felt affected by.
So, Paul, help me, just as someone outside the faith, to at least sort of, understand how you're coming at it from, or maybe even how, and Santi, by all means, jump in on this as well. Is what is, I don't want to say should, but maybe just let's do it descriptively, given everything we've talked about so far. What's the relationship between, as you just called it, the periphery? Earlier we called it sort of, maybe mysticism, this kind of whatever is going on in this, between that and orthodoxy. You've said that, had the church in the 80s approached things differently, and you write about it with Scorsese and the rest of it, had they had a more engaged approach, or with homosexuality and the AIDS epidemic. And you said, you can't necessarily change orthodoxy, but at least understand how a gay person has to interact with my life or something like that. What is orthodoxy, I guess, and talk to me a little bit about change and how this mystical experience and or this period that you're describing, where artists are are playing in this, crypto-religious register. How I guess I will say it. How in your view should that dialectic between orthodoxy and artistic mysticism, or whatever religious mysticism, how should that work in an ideal world? And I'll take that however you want. I guess that's the root of my question.
Right. I just don't think the question can be answered at that level of abstraction. This is why I write narrative works.
Right.
So you mentioned the review by Compact.
Oh.
Yeah. So she used the term dogmatism, and didn't really define it, which led me to believe, well, what if an emotional objection to my book is being registered that somehow is found wanting in terms of dogmatism? Well, what is dogmatism? And what is this thing that's being asserted as a counterforce to whatever it is that I'm depicting? And the fact that a person could kind of fly the flag of dogmatism in a not short review without spelling out what it is, isn't almost by definition the person who espouses dogmatism is able to say what it is?
No, fair, Paul. I was just I was just trying to sort of grasp onto what you're saying. The disappointment you said that the organized religions, could have interacted with in the 80s in a different way with the periphery that you just described.
For sure. So instead of saying how it works in an ideal world in organized religions, that's just very broad.
Yeah.
And what I would say, I just gave an example. What if the Catholic bishops, instead of condemning out of hand a movie by a person who's obviously a searching Catholic and has been all his life and comes from their own tradition, instead of following the cues from a band of fundamentalist Protestants with whom Catholics had only recently made peace, for reasons having to do more with the election and re-election of Ronald Reagan than surging forces of ecumenism, and had watched the film for themselves and had considered, well, we do teach that Christ is fully God and fully man, and to be fully man in 1987, 1988, is to consider that Christ would have doubts, that he would be divided about what he's supposed to do with his life and whether his calling is actually one that he should accept willingly or accept joyfully, and that he might actually wish to have, as a kind of counter life, a dream on the cross, a conventional family life with Mary Magdalene and children, kind of bourgeois life in a way. Is that so beyond discussing that we can't even discuss it? We're discussing it here now. Why couldn't that discussion have happened led by even a liberal bishop like Archbishop Quinn of San Francisco? Why did it not happen? It's at that level of particularity that I'm going to answer your question. Mm-hmm. If we can have this discussion here now, why couldn't the princes of the church have had that discussion in 1988? Why did the film have to be kept from viewers so that after 2 weeks playing to sold-out houses, it was kept from wider release out of prelates and Catholic and Protestant leaders kind of stoking fears of wider protests? Why did the VHS release have to be held up out of a fear of protest? Why did 10 years have to pass before we get to watch this film and talk about it for ourselves? It didn't have to be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. And I hope that, under Pope Leo, the next time a controversial piece of art comes down the pike, someone can have a second thought and say, let's look at this work and talk about it and consider that to be part of what Orthodox people have done all along.
Yeah, I think like sorry to step on you, Damir. I'm just going to back up your question and say, I think the perspective is different here from which Damir asks, because what you're saying is the institution should listen to the artist like Scorsese when he's just making a work of art to explore his faith, trying to figure things out in good faith, and the institution shut him out. I think Damir is more like coming from, hey, I'm an artist that has never met the institution, so I don't even know what orthodoxy is that Scorsese was grappling with. Right? Maybe that's where you're coming from.
No, sort of. I mean, I was asking. I think Paul's right that I was asking a sort of a broader question, which fair enough needs to be grappled with on the particular. It was more about the question of the value of institutional conservatism, I guess, and the implicit idea that if it has to, not stigmatize things and grapple with, good faith or not efforts on the outside to shift dogma. And I was just, the question is, I guess, is that, even after, the era of Francis, and I guess I'm still puzzled. I don't really, again, I don't follow the intricacies of the Catholic Church nearly enough, but I'm intrigued how there was enough consensus even among conservatives to vote for Leo, and we'll see what kind of papacy this involves. But I wonder, it overall it feels like we're in a more conservative age than the 80s, I guess is what it comes down to right now, and that there is a kind of hearkening for some sources of orthodoxy. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe you'd absolutely disagree with that. But I guess that's what I was pushing on is the value of progress, because I do think that is a story you tell in your book, right? This idea of the periphery, of the mystics, forcing, hidebound institutions to adapt, to modernize in a way. And I guess that was the root of my question. Is there you'd say, and help me understand again, your approach is like there's a positive moral value towards that kind of adaptation to modernity, that kind of innovation, if you will, right?
Yes, I mean, so when I went to Fordham, I had a professor named, and he's probably one of your viewers, Professor Bill Baumgarth, and he taught political philosophy, and he would say something about modernity or whatever, and I would raise my hand and I'd say, it's not necessarily so. And at one point he said, look, Mr. Elie, the generalization is an intellectual tool, and you hope to gain in insight what you lose in precision. So I come from a literary tradition. I've written 3 literary books trying to move past what I feel are kind of not particularly effective generalizations about culture, whether an age is conservative or not. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, and John Paul I think he was a pretty conservative pope. And I think Ronald Reagan was considered a pretty conservative president. And I think Margaret Thatcher was considered a pretty conservative prime minister. And I think the moral majority was considered a pretty conservative institution. But part of the point of telling a story like the one I've told is to show how much is missed when we generalize so broadly about an age. Here in the 80s, when the supposedly conservative culture was in the ascendant, things were just much more complicated than the zeitgeist meter could register. That Richard John Neuhaus could be yearning for a public square that would be full of robust religious ideas, but only of a certain kind. And meanwhile, John Paul II and Cardinal O'Connor wanted a robust Catholic culture to emerge, with the Pope could be in football stadiums, and the mass media would cover him like a rock star, but as long as certain issues weren't really dealt with at all. And so to tell a story like the one I've told is to suggest that blocking off this age as conservative and this is liberal, or this one as secular and this one as somehow surging rad trad, it's not particularly useful. And I know I'm in the minority. I spent 7 years writing a 500-page book to try to complicate those motifs. I know that if you're working as a public intellectual, you have to use them to a certain degree. But since I'm your guest, I'm going to speak my language.
Yeah, I think. I'm trying to see if there's an actual disagreement here. I do think that there is a narrative of our own time that says the political order is liberal, despite the fact that Donald Trump is president. But liberalism of a sort dominates most institutions in the U.S. but there is a sort of ferment, even among artists, to become more culturally and religiously traditional in one way or another. And our co-host Christine Emba does a good job of like cataloging these type of trends, and that they appear in different parts of American culture. But and it's interesting because it's a sort of the opposite of what the 80s was that I learned about in your book, which is that politically the Republicans and the conservatives were ascendant in the U.S. and the U.K., where you had Thatcher in the church. But you had this cultural ferment that was still very radical, still living their own version of the sort of carnival of the 60s. But yeah, I guess the only pushback I can imagine is that, well, it's not a pushback because your book is about the 80s, not about the present moment. I'm just trying to figure out what exactly that argument was in the Compact article. I don't really understand it. But yeah, I guess this is the kernel of insight in your book that traditionalists today should get, which is that traditionalism is not a return to a stable Catholic identity or a stable religious identity. Like, you're never going to get back to Martin Scorsese's Neighborhood when he was growing up. That traditionalism itself is cryptic in one way or another. It's another sort of remix of the elements of culture that a particular person is doing in order to figure things out. And I think that's probably where your critics also are enraged. I mean, I don't know if enraged is too dramatic, but that's probably where they would disagree with you most. That look, trad is just another option. It's not. You're not going to some primordial, truthful Catholic culture or even Jewish culture or whatever culture. You're still in the same predicament that these artists were in the 1980s.
Well, let's go back.
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.